Koama Day was born in the village of Kembu, a place so small and forgotten that it rarely appeared on regional maps. It clung to a narrow stretch of land between a dry riverbed and a cluster of ancient baobab trees, whose hollow roots held the remains of people buried long before Koama's time. Life in Kembu moved slowly, stubbornly, as if frozen in a rhythm older than memory itself. There were the same dawns of red dust, the same nights of crackling fires, the same aroma of maize porridge and wet clay whenever a brief rainstorm passed. Nothing ever changed. No one expected that the Wo growing up among the mud walls and reed roofs would become the man whose name would terrify entire districts. Even as a child, Koama never blended in. He was quiet, too quiet, with a gaze that lingered a moment longer than it should. While other Bows ran through the fields chasing goats or practiced throwing stones at fruit trees, Koama preferred to sit alone behind the storage shed, scratching shapes into the dirt or stacking small stones into circles. His mother, Lozana, tried to involve him in everyday chores, grinding maize, fetching water, sorting beans, but he often drifted away mid-task, leaving things half-done. His father, Damas Day, was stricter. A traditional man of the Yakuru people, Damas believed discipline was the foundation of a man's character. He pushed his son to follow the customs, obedience, respect, modesty, and above all, the principle of one wife, one home, one family. Koama heard the words, but they slid past him like sand through open fingers. His mind was elsewhere, always elsewhere. The earliest warning signs appeared when he was 10. He gathered several younger girls from neighboring huts and made them sit in a semicircle, while he told elaborate stories about a powerful man who ruled over 20 wives and commanded entire cities. The girls giggled at first, then grew uneasy, then ran home to complain. Lozana chastised him. Damas beat him lightly with a switch, but the punishment didn't extinguish the spark inside him. Instead, it fanned it. By the time he turned 13, the spark had become a fixation. He spoke constantly, to strangers, to cousins, to anyone forced to listen, about the power of 20. He insisted that a man who assembled 20 wives gained status, strength, influence. Most adults dismissed his claims as childish nonsense, and the other children mocked him openly. But ridicule only strengthened the idea lodged in his mind. What began as fantasy transformed into a blueprint, a goal, a promise. His parents sensed the change. They tried to bury him in physical labor, hoping exhaustion would push strange thoughts out of his head. His father forced him into the fields from sunrise to dusk, teaching him to harvest maize, chase stray goats, and repair fencing. But often they would find him sitting alone beneath the wide arms of the baobab trees, staring into the distance as if waiting for something invisible, something inevitable. The breaking point came when Koama was 15. It happened on an evening painted with orange dust. When the sun sank low and the heat finally began to fade, Damas confronted him in front of their hut, furious after hearing that Koama had repeated his 20 wives obsession. In front of the village elder sons, his father yelled with a rage the village had never heard from him before. He called Koama a disgrace, a failure, a twisted bow chasing shameful fantasies. He warned him that no woman would ever marry someone so disrespectful, so delusional. Koama stood still, expressionless, absorbing each word as if they were stones thrown at his chest. Then Damas said the sentence that would shape everything that followed. No woman will ever come into this home because of you. Not one. Not a wife, not a child. You will die alone, because that is what madness earns. A flicker passed across Koama's face, the smallest shift, but filled with something sharp and dangerous. He didn't shout back. He didn't cry. Instead, he turned away without a sound and walked into the night. His mother tried to stop him, clutching his arm, begging him to stay. But he gently removed her hand and stepped into the darkness without looking back. The last thing he did before leaving was light a small fire near the boundary of their hut. A habit had developed to calm himself. No one understood then how symbolic that flame would become. For months, Koama wandered between villages, surviving on odd jobs and sleeping wherever he found a corner of shelter. He worked as a market porter in one town, a carpenter's assistant in another, and sometimes stayed with farmers who offered him temporary room in exchange for labor. But beneath the surface, something more important was happening. Koama was observing, watching, studying. He paid close attention to how families live, how young women moved about the village, what routes they took when they were alone, how doors were locked, how guards slept. He learned the rhythm of different communities, their blind spots, their vulnerabilities. His obsession no longer lived in his imagination. It was developing into a plan. The transformation accelerated when he crossed paths with a small criminal group that stole fuel, grain, and livestock from trade caravans. Their leader, a brutal but clever man named Bumel, saw potential in Koama, a quiet intelligence, an unblinking calm, a talent for noticing the small details others missed. Within weeks, Koama became one of them, not for money, not for belonging, but for knowledge. Night raids taught him how to move silently, how to break locks, how to distract guards, how to slip into the shadows without leaving a trace. They taught him about fear, how people freeze, how they scatter, how they react. Koama studied everything, every movement, every weakness. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a nighttime raid on a supply warehouse in the village of Lanu, Koama saw her, a young girl, no older than 16, hiding behind metal drums. Her eyes were wide with terror but filled with a fierce spark, like she refused to surrender to fear. While the other bandits ransacked the place, Koama watched her. That spark lodged itself into his mind like a hook. 3 nights later, he left the band, stealing 2 guns, a machete, and a small bag of money. None of them even noticed he was gone until morning. He returned to Lanu, not for a raid, but for her. For days he observed her from a distance. He learned her schedule, when she woke, when she carried water, when she helped her mother, when she slipped away to talk with her younger brother. He memorized every route, every blind spot, every opportunity. And then he struck. He created a diversion by setting a small shed on fire on the opposite side of the village. When the flames rose and shouts filled the air, he moved quickly, quietly. He grabbed the girl from behind as she stepped out of the house to look at the smoke. Her scream never escaped her throat. His hand silenced it. He dragged her into the dark alley behind the hut, forcing her toward the bushland beyond the village. When her family realized what happened, she was already gone. That night, Koama crossed the final line. She was the first piece of his twisted ambition, the first that made his dream feel real. Within weeks, he would take the 2nd, then the 3rd, then the 4th and 5th. The boy from Kembu was dead. Only the hunter remained. The girl from Lanu was only the beginning, though even Koama himself didn't fully understand that in the first hours after her capture. They moved through the bushland in silence, the night heavy with the scent of dust and crushed leaves. She stumbled often, slowed by fear and exhaustion, but each time she did, Koama jerked her forward with a cold, impersonal steadiness, as if dragging a bundle rather than a living person. Her sobs were quiet, broken, slipping through the spaces between insects chirping in the darkness. They walked until the moon changed position and shadows shifted across the savanna floor, until the first gray hints of dawn appeared behind the thorn trees. Only then did Koama stop. He chose a small clearing surrounded by thorn bushes, where few people traveled. He tied her wrists to a tree trunk with a rope he had taken from Bumel supplies, then stepped back and studied her. She stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. He stared back with a blank calm. "This is the beginning," he said quietly, but not to her, more to himself. She didn't ask what he meant. She only cried. For the next 2 days, they moved deeper into the bush, until they reached an abandoned animal enclosure. Nothing but broken wooden fencing and a collapsed shelter that had once housed goats. It wasn't much, but it was far enough from any village that screams would dissolve into empty air. Here, Koama made the place his own. He reinforced part of the shelter with branches, laid a makeshift roof over one side, tied the girl's rope to a beam, and created his first base of operations. Her name was Sonali. He learned it accidentally when her mother's voice echoed through the distance, before the fire in Lanu fully went out. "Sonali, Sonali, where are you?" The name stuck in his ears. He didn't speak it aloud, but he remembered it. For several days, Sonali remained silent except for her cries. Koama, however, spoke often, not to her, but in her presence. He talked to the air, to the ground, to the future he imagined. He repeated the same phrases like mantras. 20 is the mark. 20 is a foundation. 20 is the beginning of a new line. Sonali listened with stiff fear. She didn't understand the full meaning of his words, but she felt the weight of them, the way they pressed into her like an invisible hand. 3 days after establishing the base, Koama realized he needed food, water, and supplies to sustain his plan, so he tied Sonali's wrists and ankles firmly, ensured she couldn't escape, and left her to the darkness of the ruined enclosure. Then he walked for hours until he reached the outskirts of a trading village. He bought dried cassava with stolen money, filled two jerry cans with water from a communal tap, and stole a blanket from a market stall. No one paid him particular attention. He was just another wandering young man. When he returned, Sonali had exhausted her voice from crying, and her eyes were swollen from sleeplessness. He placed the food near her but did not untie her. Fear, he knew, kept people from making reckless decisions. 2 nights later, he made his second capture. It happened in a village south of the river, a place known for its lively Sunday market and narrow pathways between crowded huts. The girl's name was Mar. She sold mangoes with her grandmother in the mornings, then carried leftover produce back home in woven baskets. Koama studied her for 3 days. She was predictable, quiet, and moved alone for a short window in the evening. He chose that moment. He approached from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she could scream. She caked, dropped the basket, mangoes rolling across the dirt road. But he lifted her easily and carried her into the shadow alley between 2 mud-walled homes. Once concealed, he tied her wrists and moved quickly through the back plots of the village. People nearby laughed, argued, cooked, tended fires. Life continued around them, unaware of the abduction taking place just meters away. By the time someone found the fallen mangoes, Koama was already gone. Mar joined Sonali in the enclosure before dawn. Sonali screamed when she saw another girl dragged inside, but the sound dissolved into the emptiness around them. With 2 captives now under his control, Koama felt something new, momentum. His hands trembled with a quiet excitement, a sense that his obsession had finally taken shape. The shape of something he could hold, something he could multiply. He added more branches to the shelter. He constructed a crude barrier around the space using thorn branches he dragged from the nearby bush. He fashioned a second rope post for Mar. He was building something, a primitive, horrifying foundation for what he believed would someday become a family. The third capture was harder. The girl, Lita, was 17 and lived in a fishing village near a narrow river with unpredictable currents. She was strong, confident, and far more alert than the others. She noticed him watching her, though she didn't understand why. She confronted him once, asking if he was lost. He only stared. She left quickly, unsettled. That night, he planned to take her while she washed clothes near the river. But she brought a friend with her, breaking the routine he had counted on. Koama waited in the shadows for 2 hours, then abandoned the attempt. He followed her again for another day, adjusting his strategy. He succeeded on the second attempt, slipping behind her when she walked alone through a narrow path bordered by tall elephant grass. She fought fiercely, enough that he had to tie her hands before carrying her away from the path. She cursed him, bit him, scratched deep lines across his arm. It didn't stop him. If anything, resistance fed his determination. Lita arrived at the enclosure bruised, furious, shouting threats that echoed in the night. Sonali and Mar sat in terror, watching her struggle against her ropes until she exhausted herself. Koama did not intervene. He sat at the entrance of the enclosure and stared into the darkness, listening to the sound of insects between Lita's ragged breaths. The 4th and 5th captures followed quickly, each in different villages. The 4th, Adisa, lived near a main trading row and was taken during the chaos of a marketplace quarrel. People were shouting, pushing, arguing about stolen coins. No one noticed Koama slipping behind a row of crates, covering Adisa's mouth, and dragging her between the stalls. He moved through the maze of wooden stands like smoke, vanishing into the tree line before anyone realized he was missing. The 5th, Yonali, disappeared after leaving her home early one morning to collect firewood. The sun had barely risen. She walked alone, humming a song her mother taught her. She never finished it. Koama stepped from behind a boulder and grabbed her, before she could drop the bundle of sticks in her arms. She fainted from shock. When she awoke, she was tied beside the others. With 5 captives now gathered in the enclosure, the atmosphere changed. The ground felt heavier. The air seemed thicker. Even Koama sensed the weight of what he had done. But instead of doubt, a new certainty settled into him. The certainty that the first phase of his plan was complete. The foundation of 20 had begun. The girls behaved differently, each coping with fear in her own way. Sonali, the first, grew quiet. She moved only when necessary, her eyes distant and vacant. Mar wept often, whispering prayers under her breath. Lita, though tied, never stopped watching for opportunities to escape. Adisa tried to comfort the others, but her voice trembled too much to be believed. Yonali, the youngest, cried for her mother at night until her voice cracked. Koama listened to them without emotion, as though their suffering were background noise. He spent his days reinforcing the enclosure, adding wooden posts, tightening the rope ties, building a makeshift roof structure to protect his wives, as he was beginning to call them, from the sun. He didn't see them as victims, he saw them as building blocks of a grand design. He brought food and water every 2 days. He ensured they were fed enough to stay alive but not strong enough to resist him. He spoke often, muttering about the number 20, about the line he was creating, about the destiny that awaited him when the circle was complete. The girls whispered among themselves whenever he disappeared into the bush. They didn't yet have a plan to escape, only fear, shared between them like a cruel blanket. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know how far from home. They didn't know if someone would come for them. They only knew one thing. Koama wasn't finished. He was studying new villages now, moving farther, watching new girls, mapping routes, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The first 5 were merely the foundation. And foundations, he believed, were meant to be built upon. The first rains of the season arrived earlier than expected, sweeping across the savanna in sheets of silver that turned dust into mud, and shifted the shape of every path. The old goat enclosure where Koama kept his captives became unstable. The roof dripped constantly. The walls softened. The wooden beams threatened to collapse. It was no longer safe, not for him, and not for his growing ambition. Koama understood he needed a stronger base. Somewhere permanent. Somewhere hidden, somewhere that could hold not just 5, but many more. He began walking long distances at dawn and returning after dark, leaving the girls tired and shivering in the failing shelter. The rain made their ropes swell and cut deeper into their wrists. Their cries blended with the sound of water hitting the ground, turning their pain into just another part of the storm. During these long walks, Koama followed animal trails, abandoned footpaths, and narrow passages carved by water over many seasons. He studied the land with the same cold precision he once used to study people. For a week, he searched. Then he found it. Deep in the hills, hidden by tall acacia trees and thorn bushes thick enough to cut through cloth, stood the ruins of an old military outpost, a relic from a civil conflict that ended before Koama was born. Few remembered it existed, and fewer dared approach it. Stories claimed the soldiers who died there still wander as restless spirits, watching over the rusted metal and cracked cement. Koama didn't believe in spirits. What he saw was shelter, walls, and potential. The structure had 2 surviving buildings, one long rectangular barrack with holes in the ceiling, and one smaller command hut with half a roof missing. Between them lay an overgrown courtyard where weeds reached knee-height. The place smelled of rust, wet earth, and forgotten violence. It was perfect. Koama returned to the enclosure and untied the girls one by one, fastening their hands with thicker rope and forcing them to walk through mud toward the hills. The journey took hours. The ground was slippery, and Sonali fell 3 times before they reached the outpost. Mar staggered with her eyes closed, whispering a prayer with each step. Lita fought the ropes until her wrists bled again. Adisa walked silently, her face pale. Yonali cried softly, too exhausted to resist. Koama dragged them into the courtyard and tied them to wooden poles embedded in the ground. Rain soaked their hair and clothes until they were shivering uncontrollably. Koama didn't stop to comfort or punish them. Instead, he began exploring the buildings in detail, knocking loose debris from beams, testing the stability of walls, searching for anything that could be repurposed. Over the next days, he cleared the smaller hut first. He removed fallen branches, swept out mud with a piece of metal roofing, and patched the largest gap in the ceiling with sheets of rusted tin he dragged from the barracks. The hut became dry enough to serve as a holding room. He brought the girls inside during the nights, tying them along the back wall in a row. Their muffled cries echoed off the cement, swallowed by the heavy air. Koama worked with relentless purpose. He was quiet but never still. He chopped wood, dragged stones, reinforced the barracks with tree trunks, and wove thorn bushes into a fence around the courtyard. He crafted makeshift doors, using planks ripped from abandoned sheds in nearby fields. Each night he sat outside the hut, sharpening a stick to a point, staring into the darkness as the girls tried to sleep behind him. Their world narrowed to routine, fear, hunger, waiting, and the constant presence of the man who saw them not as lives, but as milestones in his imaginary empire. After a week, conditions changed. The girls noticed it first, how he began arranging the space as though preparing for more rivals. He created a second holding row inside the barracks, tying ropes to support beams. He dug a shallow pit intended for storage or concealment. He cleared a larger area in the courtyard and surveyed it with distant eyes, as if imagining the place years into the future. In his mind, the camp was transforming into something more than a hideout. It was becoming a home, his home, and the birthplace of the twisted legacy he envisioned. The girls live in an atmosphere thick with dread. Days blurred, nights stretched, rainstorms came and went. They spoke to each other in whispers, sharing fears and fragments of memories from their lives before. Lida often tried to encourage the others to stay alert, to look for weaknesses in the ropes or openings in the walls. Adisa prayed for rescue. Mar called for her grandmother in her sleep. Sonali had grown almost silent, staring at the ground more than at people. Yonali clung to anyone who would allow her close, shaking whenever she heard Koama's footsteps. The ropes chafed their skin raw. Their clothes were torn. Their bodies weakened. But their minds stayed awake with terror, because Koama never stopped moving. They could hear him walking, building, muttering, planning, always planning. On the 10th day at the camp, Koama left before sunrise and walked toward a village near the foothills. The girls heard the gate of the thorn fence creak shut behind him. Hours passed. The sun climbed high. Sweat dripped down their backs. No one spoke, afraid even of their own voices. When Koama returned, he was not alone. A sixth girl walked in front of him, her arms tight, her face streaked with dust and dried tears. She looked older than the others, perhaps 18 or 19, tall and strong. Her name, as the girls learned later, was Falima. She had been collecting water at the village pump when Koama seized her from behind, dragging her between storage huts before anyone noticed. Her struggle had been long, but ultimately useless. When the others saw her, a wave of silent despair washed over them. They knew then that there was no end to his appetite. He would keep going. He would keep building. He would keep taking. And the world outside seemed far away, unable to hear their cries buried deep in the hills. Falima resisted more than any of them had. She refused to sit quietly. She refused to lower her gaze. When Koama tied her inside the hut, she kicked at him, shouting that someone would find this place, that people were searching, that her family would come. He backhanded her once, not out of rage, but with the same cold detachment he used for everything else. The act was mechanical. She fell silent, but her rival changed the atmosphere inside the camp. For the first time since their capture, the girls had someone among them who refused to accept Koama's reality. Falima whispered to them that they must watch carefully, that every camp has a weakness, that every man, even a monster, makes mistakes. Her words weren't bold promises of freedom. They were small sparks of will, fragile, but powerful in a place made of despair. Meanwhile, Koama expanded the camp further. He reinforced the barracks roof with fresh branches and plastic sheets stolen from roadside vendors. He built a crude table from a plank and rocks. He stored bags of dried cassava and maize meal in the pit he had dug. He gathered water in barrels collected from abandoned buildings. The structure took on the eerie look of a settlement, not built for one man, but for many. On the 14th day, he brought the 7th. She was named Holly. She had been selling woven bracelets near a bus stop when he followed her into a narrow alley. She didn't scream. Shock froze her voice. By the time her family realized she was missing, Koama was already disappearing into the hills with her tied behind him. Holly's arrival made the others cry. 7. The number felt impossibly large. The walls of the camp seemed to press closer. Hope shrank. But Falima kept urging them to stay steady, to keep watching. Koama adjusted their ropes as the group grew. He separated them into smaller groups tied to different beams. He stored his knives and tools in a metal box he found in the barracks. He organized his supplies with quiet obsession. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated. The girls no longer questioned whether he had a purpose. They now feared how far that purpose would go. The 8th girl came 4 days later. Her name was Nala. She was taken near a river crossing where children often played. She had tried to run, but Koama caught her quickly. Her screams startled birds from the trees, but reached no human ears. The 9th was Zari, a schoolgirl walking home with books tucked under her arm. She fought until she lost consciousness. The 10th, Yamano, was taken in broad daylight from behind a cassava stall. 10 lives stolen, 10 families shattered, 10 voices echoing in the barracks at night. With 10 captives, the camp no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a nightmare carved into the earth itself. The girls whispered that someone must be searching for them, that 10 disappearances couldn't go unnoticed. that villages must be raising alarms. But the hills remained silent, and no footsteps approached. Koyama felt no pressure. On the contrary, he felt validation. The growing number confirmed the belief that had lived in him for years. That he was building something, that he was fulfilling a destiny only he understood. He walked among the Tide girls with the confidence of a commander inspecting soldiers. He sharpened sticks near them. He repaired walls as they watched. He spoke occasionally, saying words they dreaded. 10 now. 10 more to go. Each syllable fell like a stone into their chests. They didn't know when, or if, someone would save them. They didn't know how many more he would bring. They didn't know why the world hadn't found them yet. They only knew one thing. Koyama Day was far from finished. The dry season returned slowly, burning the last traces of rain from the earth and leaving cracks in the soil, like fractures in old bone. The savanna shifted again. Forests thinned, rivers shrank, dust rose from every step. In the hills, the camp changed with the land. The grass outside the thorn fence grew brittle and yellow. Shadows stretched longer across the courtyard. And inside the barracks, 10 captured girls watched day after day as Koyama Day moved through the camp with a confidence that chilled them more than the rains ever had. Koyama had entered a new phase. With 10 captives secured, his mind sharpened into something colder, narrower, more fixated than ever. The camp no longer felt like a place of improvisation. It felt like an operation, a project, a blueprint unfolding in real time. He walked among the wooden posts and rusted metal as if inspecting a construction site. Only he could see 10 was not a victory. 10 was halfway, and halfway, to him, meant acceleration. He woke before sunrise every day, sharpening sticks and tools outside the barracks door while the girls watched in silence. The scraping sound echoed through the cement walls, sliding under their skin. Sometimes he muttered numbers under his breath. Sometimes he counted the ropes. Sometimes he whispered the same sentence over and over until the first light touched the courtyard. 10 more. 10 more. By the third week in the hills, the girls noticed he had begun preparing separate spaces in the camp. Spaces they feared were for new rivals. He organized supplies with unsettling precision, stacking dried cassava and rice in the pit he had dug, refilling water barrels, cleaning the metal box where he kept rope and tools. He rebuilt the smaller hut's doorway, making it stronger. He added a second layer of thorn branches to the fence. He reinforced the beams inside the barracks where he planned to tie more captives. Everything he did carried the same message. The circle of 20 would be completed, no matter the cost. The girls lived within the rhythm of his obsession. Some days he tied them outside, letting the sun beat down until their vision blurred. Other days he kept them inside, forcing them to sit in tight spaces while he worked in silence. They slept in shifts, too frightened to close their eyes at the same time. Every sound, every footstep, every creak of a door sent shivers through the room. Falima, who had arrived sixth, remained the only one willing to look directly into Koyama's eyes. She watched him constantly, analyzing his patterns, memorizing his habits. She whispered to the others late at night, telling them that no man was perfect, that somewhere in his routine there must be a weakness they could use. But her words, though courageous, often felt like thin threads trying to hold together something far heavier than hope. Meanwhile, word of the disappearances was spreading across the region, though the girls did not know it yet. In several villages, elders gathered to discuss the growing number of missing daughters. Mothers cried at the edges of market squares. Fathers searched the fields at dusk, calling names into the wind. Hunters walked the riverbanks with torches. But the hills were broad and wild, and the camp was hidden in a place few dared to enter. Koyama knew this, and it emboldened him. On the first day of the new moon, he left the camp before sunrise. The girls listened to the gate creak, the rope scraping against the wood, the footsteps fading across dry leaves. Hours passed. They waited in silence, fearing the familiar moment when he would return with another girl bound and trembling behind him. He returned at dusk, with the 11th. Her name was Kaya. She worked at a roadside stall selling roasted peanuts with her father. She had just stepped away for a moment when Koyama grabbed her from behind, pressing a hand over her mouth and dragging her behind a row of stacked crates. She resisted until her knees gave out, sobbing as he carried her away from the row and into the bush. When he entered the camp with her, the others felt something break inside them. Watching the rope around Kaya's wrists, her trembling shoulders, her frightened eyes, it reminded them that every day, without rescue, meant another name added to the count. Kaya's arrival was followed by a heavy silence. One so complete it felt like the air in the barracks had thickened into something suffocating. Falima held Kaya's hand that night, whispering soft comfort even as her own voice shook. But the comfort was fragile. It had limits, and those limits were expanding with every new girl dragged into the camp. 3 days later, Koama brought the 12th. Her name was Solly. She had been fetching water near a shallow well when he crept behind her. Taking advantage of a brief moment when no one was nearby, Solly fought so desperately that Koama had to tie her ankles before lifting her. Her shouts traveled over the fields, but no one came in time. He carried her for hours, stopping only twice to tighten the knots around her wrists. When Solly was forced into the barracks, she screamed the moment she saw the other girls, as if recognizing her fate the instant her eyes met theirs. The screaming continued until Koama pressed a cloth into her mouth and tied her to the nearest beam. 12. The number gnawed at the girls' minds. They felt the walls shrinking around them. Their hearts thudded in a rhythm that matched the pacing of Koama's footsteps outside. They barely slept. They barely ate. Their throats tightened each time he left and tightened again when he returned. The camp began to change again. With 12 captives, the barracks became too cramped. Koama expanded the ropes across the walls, tying girls in pairs, organizing them in cruel symmetry. He added a second pit for supplies. He sharpened new wooden stakes. He drew marks in the dirt, measurements only he understood, as if planning a layout for the future he saw with disturbing clarity. Then came the 13th. Her name was Mary. She was taken from a village where women worked late weaving fishing nets. She cried quietly as Koama led her into the camp. Falima clenched her fists when she saw him enter with another bound girl. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw at the walls until her hands bled, but she didn't. She watched. Always watched. By now, the girls sensed a new tension in the air, a heaviness that wasn't there before. It wasn't hope. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling that something outside the camp had shifted. They didn't know it, but in the villages far away, elders were meeting more frequently. Families were organizing search groups. Rumors spread of a young man with dark eyes and silent steps who appeared in towns. The 4 girls vanished. Hunters were beginning to track footprints near the riverbeds. A pattern was forming, but Koama didn't know how close the world was getting. The 14th came quickly. Too quickly. Her name was Rena. She was seized from a path near a mango orchard. Her capture was so sudden, so silent, that even the birds seemed startled when Koama stepped away with her into the trees. 14. The camp grew quieter. The girls stopped speaking when Koama was near. They stopped crying at night, knowing the sound carried further in dry air. They saved their tears for moments when the wind rose and could swallow the nose. Koama felt the pressure of approaching his goal. He counted ropes each morning. He dragged new wood into the camp. He constructed a crude barrier inside the courtyard, dividing space as if preparing sections for what he imagined would someday become an empire, built from stolen lives. He muttered numbers more often now. His voice took on a shifting quality. Not louder, not softer, but more frayed, like something inside his mind was tightening into a single unbreakable thread. The 15th arrived on a day, and the air shimmered with heat. Her name was Yalo. She was taken as she swept the steps outside her family's home. She didn't scream. Shock froze her. She simply went limp as Koama dragged her away. 15. Inside the barracks, space had become so tight the girls struggled to sit without their shoulders touching. The smell of sweat, dust, and fear clung to the air. The walls seemed smaller each day, and Koama's presence felt larger each time he walked past them. Falima still whispered at night, but her voice was tired now. Edged with a quiet desperation she tried to hide. She told the girls that someone must be searching, that no man could hide 15 girls forever, that footsteps would come eventually. But she didn't believe it the way she once had. The 16th came with a storm of dust. Her name was Tarso. She was strong, maybe the strongest of all, and she fought until her wrists were swollen and purple from the rope. She spit at Koama when he dragged her into the barracks. He didn't react. He never reacted. Reaction required emotion, and Koama had abandoned emotion long ago. 16. The tension cracked like thin ice. The camp felt ready to burst. The girls whispered less now, not trusting their voices. They could sense something shifting, something dangerous. The 17th girl, Nalo, arrived at dusk. She had been gathering herbs at the edge of a field. She was thin, fragile, shaking violently even before Koama tied her inside the barracks. Her presence added another layer of dread to the air. 17. Koama's eyes gleamed with a manic shine. His breathing became heavier at night. He paced more aggressively. He sharpened sticks with a speed that unsettled even Falima. He was close. Too close. The 18th came 2 days later. Arunau, taken from a backyard as she hung laundry. She screamed until she collapsed, her voice hoarse by the time Koama forced her into the camp. The 19th came the next night. Lamira, taken near a river bend where children played. Her capture sent ripples through nearby villages. People finally realized a predator was moving among them. 19. There was only one left. The girls didn't know whether to pray for or fear the arrival of the 20th. Some believed the last would break something inside Koama, that he would become unpredictable, violent, uncontrollable. Others believed the last would trigger the final moments before the world outside finally intervened. Koama didn't speak much that night. He sat outside the barracks, sharpening a long stick repeatedly, the motion smooth and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock counting down. He didn't look at the 19 tied inside. He didn't need to. Tomorrow, he believed, the final one would come, and the circle would be complete. Morning arrived as a thin gray line over the hills, slicing through the darkness of the camp with a muted promise of heat. 19 girls sat tied along the barracks wall, their bodies weak, their eyes hollow, their breaths shallow. The air carried the dry scent of dust, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of old iron. Outside, Koama stood motionless in the courtyard, his back to them, staring toward the thorn fence as though the horizon were whispering to him. He hadn't slept. Not at all. His eyes were wide, too wide, bright with the feverish glow of a man who believed he could see the future through the dust. The stick he had sharpened the night before lay across his knees. His fingers tapped the wood in slow, deliberate rhythms, like a signal only he could hear. One more, he whispered. One more. The girls heard him. The words drifted into the barracks like poison. 19 sets of shoulders stiffened. 19 throats tightened. They didn't want to imagine the 20th girl. They didn't want to imagine the moment he would declare himself complete. They didn't want to imagine what came after completion in the mind of a man who believed destiny lived inside a number. Falima watched him most closely. She had not slept either. Something had changed in the air last night. Something felt sharper, heavier, as though the world beyond the hills had finally turned its attention toward the hidden nightmare inside them. She didn't know what it was. She only knew that Koama's feverish stillness was not the stillness of triumph. It was the stillness before something breaks. As the sun climbed higher, Koama rose with sudden purpose. He tied a knife to his belt, slung a rope over his shoulder, and opened the gate of the thorn fence. He glanced back at the barracks once, but not with hesitation, with calculation. Then he stepped into the dry grass, the gate creaking closed behind him. The camp fell silent. The girls waited for the familiar rhythm, the footsteps fading, the hours stretching, the eventual rustle of bushes as Koama returned dragging another trembling girl behind him. But today was different. Something felt wrong in the air, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. The morning wore on. Heat pressed down like a hand. The girls shifted uncomfortably, their ropes tight against their skin, their bodies aching from days upon days of restraint. Falima tugged lightly at her bonds, testing them. They were tight, tighter than usual. Koama had tied everyone more firmly before leaving. That alone frightened her. Hours passed. The sun rose higher. A trembling hum of insects filled the silence. The girls exchanged glances, anxious, searching. For the first time, Falima whispered something that was not about planning, or escaping, or watching. Has taken too long. No one responded, but they all felt it. When afternoon arrived, the first hint of hope appeared. Faint, like wind brushing the edge of a dream. It came as a distant echo, a soft dumping sound, barely audible over the heat shimmer. It repeated. Then again. Then again. Louder this time. The girls froze. Footsteps. No. Not footsteps. Hooves. Many. And behind them, voices. Falima lifted her head sharply. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Men shouting commands, boots striking dirt, metal clinking. It was faint, but enough. Enough to push hope into the cracks of despair. The girls began to tremble, not with fear this time, with something dangerously close to belief. The belief was a fragile thing. They had seen too much, endured too much. They were afraid to let it bloom. Minutes passed. The sounds grew louder, clearer. Falima's breathing quickened. She leaned as far forward as her ropes would allow. Someone is coming. The others didn't answer, but their bodies stiffened with the same electric tension. Eyes widened. Hearts quickened. Silence swallowed the barracks again. But now it was the silence of anticipation. Then, without warning, the gate of the thorn fence crashed open. The girls screamed. But it wasn't Koama. 5 men rushed inside the courtyard wearing dust-covered boots, carrying rifles, machetes, and hunting spears. Their faces were hard, grim, focused. They moved with the urgency of men who had searched for too long and suffered too many losses. Their clothes were the colors of several different villages, proof that desperation had finally united people who rarely worked together. Behind them, dozens more moved through the trees, forming a line that stretched across the hillside. The world outside had finally found them. One of the men shouted, "Check every corner." Another yelled, "Look inside the huts." A third pointed at the barracks. "There. I hear voices." Falima cried out first, her voice breaking. "We're here. We're here." The men ran toward the barracks, tearing the wooden door open with a force fueled by rage and grief. When they entered and saw 19 thin, bruised, terrified girls tied to beams, something inside them cracked. Some gasped, some cursed, some lowered their weapons in disbelief. A man with a gray beard stepped forward, tears filling his eyes. "My God, what has he done?" The girls sobbed, weak but relieved. The men rushed to cut the ropes. Falima's wrists were freed first. She collapsed into the arms of one of the rescuers, her breath shaking with the realization that they were no longer alone. Others were freed next: Mar, Sonali, Holly, Yala, each one falling into the hands of men who lifted them with the gentleness of people who had feared they would never find their daughters again. As the rescuers worked, another group of men searched the courtyard, inspecting the pits, the tools, the trails leading away from the camp. One of them shouted, "Has not here." Another called back, "Find him. He can't be far." The hills erupted with movement. Men chased footprints, examined broken grass, followed the faint trail Koama had left in the morning. The girls watched from the barracks doorway, trembling, terrified that he might reappear. But the rescuers' presence was overwhelming. Dozens of them now, surrounding the camp like a living wall. Falima's voice was shaky, but steady enough to speak. He went to look for the 20th. A wave of anger moved through the rescuers. One man slammed his fist against the wall. "Not another one," he growled. "Not a single one more." They poured into the trees, calling to one another in urgent bursts. Minutes later, a shout echoed through the hills. "Tracks! Fresh!" Another shout followed. "Has close." Falima gripped the edge of the barracks door, her breath trembling. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine an ending. An ending where the man who had stolen their lives would no longer control the next breath they took. Beyond the thorn fence, the sound of pursuit intensified. Cracking branches, pounding boots, shouts carried by the wind. The girls huddled together, clutching one another, praying neither for mercy nor vengeance, but simply for the nightmare to end. A sharp cry split the air. A man's voice, pained. Then another. Then silence. A heavy silence. Falima's stomach twisted. Was it him? Was it one of the rescuers? Was the 20th girl somewhere out there? Before she could form another thought, 3 men emerged from the trees carrying a young girl. The missing 20th. Her arms were tied, but she was alive, trembling, terrified. The rescuers laid her gently on the ground. Behind them, 2 more men dragged Koama Day. He was still alive, barely. His shirt was torn, his arms scraped by thorn branches, his breath shallow. His eyes flickered with the last remnants of his feverish obsession. Wild, unfocused, unbroken. The men threw him into the courtyard like discarded cloth. He hit the ground with a dull thud. The girls recoiled instinctively, even though he was no longer a threat. Koama lifted his head weakly. His gaze found the barracks, found the 19 faces staring back at him. His lips barely moved, but they shaped words he could no longer speak. 20, it was all he ever cared about, all he ever lived for. A number he believed would make him immortal. But numbers don't save men. Numbers don't erase crimes. Numbers don't protect monsters. A rescuer stepped forward, the gray-bearded man who had cut Falima's ropes. Rage twisted his face, but he didn't touch Koama. He didn't need to. Justice would come in ways the court understood. Justice would come in chains, bars, and locked doors. The girls watched as the rescuers bound Koama's wrists and ankles. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. The obsession that had consumed him finally collapsed under the weight of the world. He thought he could outrun. As the rescuers helped the girls out of the camp, Falima paused at the doorway. She looked back one last time at the barracks, the ropes, the rusted walls, the shadows that had held them captive. Then she stepped into the sunlight. The nightmare did not evaporate. The scars would remain. The memories would follow them. Healing would take years, maybe lifetimes, but they were alive, free, together, and the hills were finally silent. Where once a hunter had walked, there was now nothing but dust, wind, and the fading footprints of a man who had believed he could build a kingdom of stolen lives. He had fallen, and the world he tried to build fell with him.